It couldn't be. The Prime Minister has requested to make a short statement on today's publication of the final report of the infected blood inquiry. On this occasion, given the nature of the statement, I have agreed that there will only be a few limited brief responses today, as there will be a further major statement tomorrow when all honourable members will have the opportunity to question the Cabinet Office Minister at length. I now call the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, Sir Brian Langstaff has today published the final report of the infected blood inquiry. This is a day of shame for the British state. Today's report shows a decades-long moral failure at the heart of our national life. From the National Health Service to the Civil Service, to ministers in successive governments, at every level, the people and institutions in which we place our trust failed in the most harrowing and devastating way. They failed the victims and their families, and they failed this country. Sir Brian finds a catalogue of systemic, collective and individual failures, each on its own serious and taken together amounting to a calamity. And the result of this inquiry should shake our nation to its core. This should have been avoided. It was known these treatments were contaminated. Warnings were ignored repeatedly. Time and again, people in positions of power and trust had the chance to stop the transmission of those infections. Time and again, they failed to do so. Sir Brian finds an attitude of denial towards the risks of treatment. Worse, to our eternal shame, in a way that it is hard to even comprehend, they allowed victims to become objects for research. Many, including children, at Lord Mayor Treloar's College were part of trials, conducted without their or their parents' knowledge or consent. Those with haemophilia or bleeding disorders were infected with HIV, hepatitis C, and hepatitis B through NHS treatment, through blood clotting products such as Factor VIII, including those who had been misdiagnosed and did not even require treatment. Many were infected through whole blood transfusions. Others were infected through their partners and loved ones, often after diagnoses had been deliberately withheld for months or even years, meaning these infections should have easily been prevented. I find it almost impossible to comprehend how it must have felt to be told you had been infected through no fault of your own with HIV or hepatitis B or hepatitis C, or to face the grief of losing a child, or to be a young child and lose your mum or dad. Many of those infected went on to develop horrific conditions including cirrhosis, liver cancer, pneumonia, TB and AIDS, enduring debilitating treatments like interferon for these illnesses the NHS had given them. Many were treated disdainfully by healthcare professionals who made appalling assumptions about the origin of their infections. Worse still, they were made to think that they were imagining it, made to feel stupid. They felt abandoned by the NHS that had infected them. Those who acquired HIV endured social rejection, vilification, and abuse at a time when society understood so little about the emerging epidemic of AIDS. And with illness came the indignity of financial hardship, including for carers and those widowed and other bereaved family members. And throughout it all, victims and their loved ones have had to fight for justice, fight to be heard, to be believed, fight to uncover the full truth. Some had their medical records withheld or even destroyed, and the inquiry finds that some government papers were destroyed in a deliberate attempt to make the truth more difficult to reveal. Sir Brian explicitly asks the question, was there a cover-up? Let me directly quote his answer for the House. There has been. He continues, not in the sense of a handful of people plotting in an orchestrated conspiracy to mislead. but in a way that was more subtle, more pervasive, and more chilling in its implications. To save face and to save expense, there has been a hiding of much of the truth. Mr. Speaker, more than 3,000 people died without that truth. They died without an apology. They died without knowing how and why this was allowed to happen. And they died without seeing anyone held to account. Today I want to speak directly to the victims and their families, some of whom are with us in the gallery. I want to make a wholehearted and unequivocal apology for this terrible injustice. First, to apologise for the failure in blood policy and blood products and the devastating and so often fatal impact this had on so many lives, including the impact of treatments that were known or proved to be contaminated, the failure to respond to the risk of imported concentrates, the failure to prioritise self-sufficiency in blood, the failure to introduce screening services sooner, and the mismanagement of the response to the emergence of AIDS and hepatitis viruses amongst infected blood victims. Second, to apologise for the repeated failure of the state and our medical professionals to recognise the harm caused. This includes the failure of previous payment schemes, the inadequate levels of funding made available, and the failure to recognise hepatitis B victims. And third, to apologise for the institutional refusal to face up to these failings, and worse, to deny and even attempt to cover them up. The dismissing of reports and campaigners' detailed representations, the loss and destruction of key documents, including ministerial advice and medical records, and the appalling length of time it took to secure the public inquiry which has delivered the full truth today. Mr. Speaker, layer upon layer of hurt endured across decades. This is an apology from the state to every single person impacted by this scandal. It did not have to be this way. It should never have been this way. And on behalf of this and every government stretching back to the 1970s, I am truly sorry. Mr. Speaker, today is a day for the victims and their families to hear the full truth acknowledged by all, and in the full presence of that truth, to remember the many, many lost loved ones. But justice also demands action and accountability. So I make two solemn promises. First, we will pay comprehensive compensation to those infected and those affected by this scandal, accepting the principles recommended by the inquiry, which builds on the work of Sir Robert Francis. Whatever it costs to deliver this scheme, we will pay it. And my right honourable friend, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, will set out the details tomorrow. Second, it is not enough to say sorry, pay long overdue compensation, and then attempt to move on. There can be no moving on from a report that is so devastating in its criticisms. Of course, in some areas, medical practice has long since evolved, and no one is questioning that every day our NHS provides amazing and life-saving care to the British people. But Sir Brian and his team have made wide-ranging recommendations. We will study them in detail before returning to this House with a full response. And we must fundamentally rebalance the system so we finally address this pattern so familiar from other inquiries like Hillsborough, where innocent victims have to fight for decades just to be believed. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, the whole House will join me in thanking Sir Brian and his team, especially for keeping the infected blood community at the heart of their work. We would not be here today without those who tirelessly fought for justice for so many years. I include journalists and parliamentarians in both houses, especially the Right Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North. Yeah. But most of all, the victims and their families, many of whom have dedicated their lives leading charities and campaign groups, pouring their own money into decades of running helplines, archiving, researching, pursuing legal cases, often in the face of appalling prejudice. It is impossible to capture the full pain and injustice they have faced. Their sorrow has been unimaginable. They have watched loved ones die, cared for them as they suffered excruciating treatments or provided their palliative care. Many families were broken up by the strain. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been knocked off course, dreams and potential unfulfilled. But today, their voices have finally been heard. The full truth stands for all to see. And we will work together across government, our health services and civil society to ensure that nothing like this can ever happen in our country again. I commend this statement to the House.
Call Keir Starmer, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This response can only begin in one place, because this is an injustice that has spanned across governments on an unprecedented scale, and collectively we fail to protect some of the most vulnerable in our country. And so, as well as paying tribute to the courage and determination of the victims, the infected and the affected, some of whom are here in the gallery today, I want to acknowledge to every single person who has suffered that in addition to all of the other failings, politics itself failed you. That failure applies to all parties, including my own. There is only one word: sorry. And by that apology, I acknowledge that this suffering was caused by wrongdoing, delay, and systemic failure across the board, compounded by institutional defensiveness. And as Sir Brian Langstaff makes clear in his report, any apology today must be accompanied by action. And so I welcome the Prime Minister's confirmation that compensation will now be paid. And he should be under no doubt whatsoever that we will work with him to get that done swiftly. Because make no mistake, the victims in this scandal have suffered unspeakably. Thousands of people have died. They continue to die every week. Lives completely shattered. Evidence willfully destroyed. Victims marginalised. People watching their loved ones die. Children used as objects of research. On and on it goes. The pain barely conceivable. And so, as well as an apology, I also want to make clear we commit that we will shine a harsh light upon the lessons that must be learned to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Because, Mr. Speaker, when you pass through the doors of a hospital, it is a moment of profound vulnerability. You entrust your life into the hands of perfect strangers. We go to hospital for care. And that is what many of the people affected find so hard to accept, the betrayal of that trust by people and institutions that were meant to protect them. People like Mark Stewart, my constituent, who was given Factor VIII in the 1980s as part of a clinical trial, as was his father, as was his brother. All three subsequently contracted hepatitis C. But only Mark remains with us today. And then over the decades, as Mark and so many like him searched for truth and justice, the British state ignored them. The truth, as Sir Brian says today, was hidden from them for decades. And that is why this is one of the gravest injustices this country has seen. And yet we have to be honest. This scandal is not unique. And the institutional defensiveness identified by Sir Brian is a pattern of behaviour that we must address. Because, Mr. Speaker, while Mark may never get his brother, his father, or his health back, for all the families affected, we must restore the sense that this is a country that can rectify injustice, particularly when carried out by institutes of the state. That is our job today, this week, and beyond. Frankly, it is the very least that we owe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for the collegiate tone in which he has responded to today's report and his sincerity. He is right, it is irrefutably clear that an unconscionable injustice has been done, the result of a consistent and systemic failure by the state time and again for decade after decade, and it's why I apologise wholeheartedly and unequivocally to every single person impacted by this scandal. And the anger and sorrow felt across this House is the right response. And it is right that we now act on behalf of the victims, their loved ones, and the whole community who expect us to put right this historic wrong.
Father of the House, Sir Peter of Bottomley.
The thousands of people at Central Hall thanked Sir Brian Langstaff. He thanked them. We should acknowledge, as has already been said, the Right Honourable Lady for Hull North and her leadership of the all-party group. Can I say to my right honourable friend that permanent secretaries and cabinet secretaries need to say to everyone throughout their chain, are we doing something which is right? Are we doing something which is necessary? Are we doing something which will work? If those questions had been asked more effectively, would my right honourable friend agree that the number of tragedies would not have been 5 for every MP in this House, not 5 times more for everyone who's injured or affected, but the numbers would have been greatly reduced and we'd have learnt the truth earlier.
Well, can I start, Mr. Speaker, by thanking my right honourable friend for his dedicated work co-chairing alongside the member for Kingston upon Hull North, the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. And I can assure him that Sir Brian's report is highly detailed and sets out a number of recommendations, and I can assure my right honourable friend that we will respond to it in full as quickly as possible.
SNP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to begin by stating something which I think we all now agree is self-evidently the case, that this scandal represents the very worst of Westminster. Decades of deflection, decades of denial, and of course decades of deceit. Children used as research, parents watching their children die, children watching their parents die. Tens of thousands of people impacted, many of whom, of course, are not here to see this day. And for those who imposed this tragedy upon them, no consequences have yet been felt. But today is not about them. Today is about the victims. And to them, on behalf of myself and my colleagues in the Scottish National Party on these benches, I wish to offer you 3 things. First is an apology. I am incredibly sorry that this happened to you. Second is to say quite openly, thank you. Thank you for your determination and your desire, for being able to pry open the doors of this place and ensure that your voices were heard by all of us. We would not be here today without your efforts. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, it's to say to the victims that I can assure you, we will do everything that we can to ensure that the government implements the recommendations as laid out today. Now, I've heard the Prime Minister make a very sincere promise in relation to compensation. And I would like to say to him that we will work with him and his government and indeed any future government to ensure that that promise is swiftly kept?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the absolute consensus that today is a moment for the families and the community and their voices to be heard loudest. Every single testimony and account set out in Sir Brian's report today sets out a unique story of hurt, suffering and loss. Individually, these accounts are astounding. Taken together, they are truly unimaginable. They must be heard and they must be understood, as the Honourable Gentleman said. And I thank him for his remarks, and I know that we share a determination to work together to ensure that nothing like this shocking and avoidable calamity can ever happen in our country again.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Speaker. Sir Brian Langstaff's report today has finally uncovered the truth of this appalling tragedy which has affected the lives of so many. And so many have been fighting, as the Prime Minister said and the Leader of the Opposition said, for decades to get to this point. Sir Brian has highlighted what is a devastating and abject failure of the British state. Medical professionals, civil servants, politicians, all of whom felt their job was to protect their own reputation rather than to serve and look after the public who they were there to serve. As we rightly today remember all the victims of this terrible tragedy, will my right honourable friend commit himself unashamedly to working to ensure that all those in government, politicians and civil servants, recognise that their job is to serve the public and not to protect themselves?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for her statement. As Prime Minister, she launched Sir Brian's inquiry and in doing so began the process of establishing the full truth we have heard today. There is no doubt, as she recognises, that the inquiry came too late, that compensation came too late, was woefully insufficient, and the consequences of that failure are stark. And that is why today I apologise on behalf of governments since the 1970s for that shameful failure. But I can also assure her that Sir Brian and his team have made a series of wide-ranging recommendations, and we will study every single one of them in detail and work urgently across government and public organisations, our health services and civil society, all to ensure that nothing like this can ever happen again, but also that we end the challenges that she encountered, where the institutions responsible for serving the public, including the NHS and civil service, are more concerned by cost than accountability.
Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, today is about the tens of thousands of people whose lives have been torn apart by this disaster. Many of them have fought and waited for decades to see this day, and tragically thousands have died waiting, as the Prime Minister reminded us. I pay tribute to the survivors, the families, the campaigners and the journalists who fought so long and so hard for justice. Having listened to their stories and now seen the evidence laid bare in this report, I want, on behalf of my party, to echo the Prime Minister's apology. We are all truly sorry for the pain people have suffered over decades under governments of all parties, and for the failures of politicians and the state to do the most fundamental job to keep people safe. We must now ensure full compensation is paid without any more delay, and we must also make sure that nothing like this can ever happen again. In his report, Sir Brian highlights how, and I quote, "The truth has been hidden for decades through a lack of openness, transparency and candour that has caused enormous damage." So will the Prime Minister join me in backing the survivors' call for a duty of candour on all public officials?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his remarks. Across this House, we share a determination to work together to ensure that nothing comparable to this shocking and avoidable tragedy can happen ever again in our country. Today is a day for the victims and their families to hear the full truth unequivocally acknowledged by all and to remember the many, many lost loved ones. So the Minister for the Cabinet Office will be making a full statement tomorrow, but we will study every one of Sir Brian's recommendations in detail and work urgently across all parts of civil society to ensure innocent victims are never again forced to fight for decades to be believed.
Such as Javed.
The statement by my right honourable friend and indeed the words of the Leader of the Opposition. Mr Speaker, this scandal, the biggest in the history of the NHS, but also Mid Staffordshire, Ockenden, the Cash Review, all of these scandals are linked by public servants putting the reputation of themselves and the NHS above that of patient safety and care. And time again, ministers have stood at that dispatch box of the successive governments, including myself, promising that lessons will be learned. So can I ask my right honourable friend, why will it be any different this time?
Mr Speaker, Sir Brian's report is categoric that this scandal represents a decades-long moral failure of the state, but in particular he highlights an appalling truth, that our National Health Service failed. It was known that blood and blood products given by medical professionals were contaminated. It is correct to acknowledge that medical practice has evolved. Every day, hundreds of thousands of our NHS staff do provide life-saving care to the British people, and we are incredibly grateful. But the report today sets out clear and wide-ranging recommendations that we must study closely, and we will work urgently with our health services to ensure that nothing like this will ever happen again.
Final person on this is Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and his apology on behalf of the nation? Can I also thank Sir Brian for his report today? Finally, the truth. It's a vindication of the nearly 50 years of campaigning for justice, and I want to pay tribute to all those infected and affected, and also, importantly, those who've lost their lives in the biggest treatment disaster of the history of the NHS, with 2 people dying on average still every week. I wondered if the Prime Minister understands that whilst accepting the moral case for compensation to be paid in December 2022, the failure of his government to act on the second interim report by Sir Brian in April 23 has added another layer of hurt. And I hope very much from what the Prime Minister has said this afternoon that by the end of this year, compensation payments will start to be made to all those infected and affected.
Mr Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for her statement and for her care and unwavering dedication to delivering justice. She knows better than anyone in this House the devastation this scandal has inflicted upon the community and the strength they have shown in their fight for the truth. Sir Brian's report sets out a decades-long failure and makes clear that this is a moment of national shame. No one could be failed to be moved by the stories within it, by the utterly shameful treatment of victims and their loved ones, by the callousness and the cruelty that they suffered, by their outstanding bravery and resilience and refusal to yield to a lifetime of prejudice and trauma. They have fought for the truth to be out. They were right. And above all, today is a day for their voices to be heard.
That completes this short statement. Tomorrow there will be a full statement. Can I finish first, please? Tomorrow there will be a full statement where all the details of compensation will be brought to the House and all members will be able to get it. Pete Wishart.
Very much, Mr Speaker. Have you received any explanation why we're only getting half an hour of the Prime Minister's time? Now, I know there's going to be a statement tomorrow from the Paymaster General, and we're all looking forward to it. But what could be more important than this, than being here, taking questions from honourable members?
I'll answer the question. You've asked me the question. I've worked very closely with different parties, and more importantly, and very importantly, it is about the families. It's their day, and that's why it's been done in this way. And I'm sure you will wish to respect that rather than question it. Right.